Now, I talk to clients and investors a lot about true cash flow and paper cash flow. There's the numbers you write down on the paper with your projections, and then there's the reality of what's actually going to happen.
Welcome to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association, providing benefits and services to real estate investors and rental property owners for over 48 years. With your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group.
Hi, everyone. Before we get started, I would like to thank all of you for listening to this show, and hopefully you've been getting a lot of value from it. I know I certainly have enjoyed hosting it and talking to all of our great guests, and I can tell that a lot of people are listening to the show. We have listeners in all 50 states and throughout the world. And one thing I would like to ask you, if you've been enjoying this show, is that you go to iTunes and subscribe, rate, and review. By giving us a rating and a review, it really helps to drive more listeners to the show and allows us to continue providing the great content that we've been bringing to you so far. And I happen to have in front of me one of the reviews that was left on iTunes, and this is by Sincere1. Maybe it's Sincere1. Brian and his guests have done a wonderful job of explaining the ins and outs of everyday real estate investing. They take the complex and break it down into the simple. Thank you, Sincere One. I sincerely appreciate your review and kind words. I also have another review from a listener named Mech Blue. This podcast is exactly the type of concise, informative, and engaging show that I've been looking for. I'm looking forward to hearing a detailed case study and will be listening on a regular basis. And well, if you've been listening, Mech Blue, then I know you've already heard several of our guests go through some pretty detailed case studies, and I will be bringing you more in the future. Anyway, if you would, please go to iTunes, subscribe, rate, and review. That will help keep this show going. Many thanks, and let's get into the show. Hello and welcome to episode 38. If you've been a listener to this show for a while, then you've no doubt heard the name of my guest today. I'm very honored to have Allison Koetsier on the show with me today. Allison is a successful investor in single-family and multifamily rentals, and she's also an associate broker with Compass Realty Services, where she has the distinction of selling more multifamily homes than any other realtor in the greater Grand Rapids area within the past year. Allison is also a veterinarian and an MSU alum. So Allison, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me, Brian.
All right. Well, I made it through that introduction. You've been name-checked on this show at least 4 times by 4 different guests. You've been called a rock star real estate broker. You know, a number of people have mentioned you, so I'm glad that you were finally able to join me.
I'm very excited to be here today.
All right, fantastic. Well, let's get into it. Let's start with your background, because you are a veterinarian. You went to Michigan State University, became a veterinarian, which is a very, very hard program to get into in the first place and then get through. And now you're in real estate. So can you talk about that and how you went from one to the other?
Well, it's definitely an odd combination. You don't find many veterinary realtors. So I graduated from Michigan State, was very excited to be a veterinarian, save all the animals of the world. And it's a wonderful career, but it's really more about working with the people than working with the animals. So you definitely become good at, helping people solve their problems and work through, unfortunately, some difficult situations with their pets. There's a time as a veterinarian that my hours were such that I was working 3 long days and I had several days off. And my father came to me and said, hey, we should buy some rental property.
Your father being Tom Koetsier, who a
Yes.
lot of people know in Grand Rapids.
Yes. And I thought, well, okay, sure. I love the idea of some residual income and be fun to work with my dad. So we did what, we think most people should do is we went out and we hired a realtor and we started looking at some houses and we thought that was going pretty well. And we found a house that we thought was going to be perfect. It was brick, 4-unit, all the units were identical. We thought it was in pretty good shape. The price was right. We saw the potential for cash flow. So with our realtor's help, we bought our first investment property as I was still working as a veterinarian, and we closed on that deal. And then we learned, probably about a week after we had purchased that property, about this thing called city certification in Grand Rapids, which is a process where the city inspects rental property and they have certain checklists and regulations that you need to meet. Some of them make a lot of sense, and if you have a decent property, you're going to meet those requirements. And some of them about how many outlets you need to have in a room and where the bath fan has to go, and certain things are maybe a little less helpful to the total performance of your home. But we had no idea about this. Our realtor had never spoken of this, had never told us about this. And the property we ended up buying definitely was in a rougher neighborhood. So we had some tenant challenges that we probably weren't prepared for at that time. We did some evictions. We weren't really familiar with that process until we went through it. So we got a real good education with that first property. And after that, we kind of figured, well, that realtor didn't own any investment property and didn't really know a lot about it. So they didn't really help us. So maybe we should get our real estate licenses. So we did get our real estate licenses just to buy and sell our own properties.
So this is after buying your first 4-unit investment property. You had a realtor or a broker who really didn't understand investment property and the fact that it would have to be certified by the city. You might have some tenant issues. And you just decide, oh, well, let's become realtors ourselves.
That was pretty much the process.
So back up a little bit, because your dad came to you and said, why don't we invest in real estate? What made him even think that?
I think he'd always had an interest in real estate, and he comes from a food service background before he became a real estate broker. And the idea of, residual income, where you didn't necessarily have to be there, you didn't necessarily have to be actually actively working at that to create wealth. So he's always been very interested in financial markets and been pretty money savvy. So the idea that we could make money without having to be there, as a, W-2 employee, you go in, you work, you get paid. You don't go to work, you don't get paid. So I think he was hoping, one, to better his life and better my life by finding a way that we could hopefully work less and have more money.
It seems like you did end up doing a lot more because you bought this investment property, realized you had some issues you had to deal with. I imagine you were managing it yourself at the time?
Oh, yes. We were managing it ourselves. The one thing that we did do right was we did join the Rental Property Owners Association. And they had way more information than our realtor ever thought of having. And they were instrumental in helping us with our forms and walking us through our first evictions and giving us all the aid and answers to questions that we didn't have.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of, you kind of just said it yourself, you invested for somewhat passive income. However, you ended up becoming a lot more active than I think you anticipated you would have to be. So active to the point where you said, well, let's just become realtors ourselves and make this another profession that we can get into. Did you do that out of need, or did you do that because you had the bug and you were excited by real estate?
I'm not sure that my dad had actually become a realtor before I did. And that kind of, he was the one that first went and got his license because I kind of had the veterinary career thing going. So he got his license first. And then it just seemed to make sense for me to have mine too. And I thought that would be, the two of us together having both of our license would make more sense. He had lived in a owner-occupied duplex for a time. And that was actually what I ended up doing also at the same time period. I ended up buying a owner-occupied duplex that I lived in the lower and rented the upper. So that was probably a much more positive housing experience as far as nice house, nice neighborhood, very, very inexpensive way to live. If that is something that you have an interest in, investing in real estate, and you're okay living in close proximity to one of your tenants, it's a wonderful way to decrease your living expenses with the things that you can write off, and just you can live for virtually nothing.
Yeah, I've had a couple guests on the show who've talked about house hacking, which is basically doing that, buying a duplex, living in one side, having your tenant on the other side pay all your bills and expenses. And I think it's a fantastic way to get into real estate and to do what you just said, which is bring in some passive income and live for free, essentially.
It also gives you a ton of different options. So lived in that duplex for almost 10 years. And then when it was time to get a bigger house, had a young child, the market was down. So I was able to buy the house I wanted to live in for less money, but I didn't have to sell my duplex at a loss. I was able to keep it, move in a tenant to the unit I'd been living in, and it was still a great investment. So I still, own that today.
Yeah, you essentially doubled your income from the duplex once you moved out of it.
Correct. So it's so many upsides to that arrangement. And it also helps you with very good tenants, because when you're living there and you say, hey, I live here, you're going to get a pretty good tenants who don't want to pay you or are going to be, having parties and the type of thing, don't want to live with their landlord. So you get a very good class of tenant, and it does help you learn how to work with tenants in that situation.
And do you still own that duplex?
Yes.
So you still own it. What about the 4-unit?
We have sold that 4-unit, and we did some improvements, sold at the right time, and despite all the things that went wrong with that and the things that we didn't know, we ended up doing very well on that investment.
Is that the one on Lafayette?
It's actually on Straight Street.
All right. Well, let's get back to your story then, because you still are a veterinarian.
Yes, I am. I still work very part-time as a veterinarian. I have talked about leaving the profession, but obviously a lot of schooling into it, and I do really enjoy it. So it's hard to walk away, but definitely my primary career is as a real estate broker at this time.
The nice thing is that real estate is allowing you to do both.
Correct.
That gives you a lot of flexibility.
It does give me a lot of flexibility. And like I said, I think it was a really good way to learn to, work with clients. And people are very passionate about their pets. They're very passionate about their money and, their investments. And it actually fits better together than you think it would.
So you certainly jumped in feet first into the investing and being a realtor. What made you start with a 4-unit? Because a lot of people, when they think about getting into real estate investing, they feel that a single family house is a lot easier and safer to get into. Why did you go to 4 units right away?
I would definitely agree with you that starting with a single family and a duplex is probably the way to go. And that's typically the advice I give my clients. I think that was the deal that we found, and our realtor didn't talk to us about the more people you have in close proximity, the more tenant issues you're going to have, the potential for more tenant turnover. We were just not aware of those things.
So your experience with your first realtor was really, he was just a salesman. He just helped you find a property, but didn't really prepare you for what managing that property would entail.
Correct. There was no real discussion about rental rates, the types of pros and cons of the investment we were looking at. And actually, we were the ones that actually found the house, and then he was basically the one that showed us through and did the paperwork.
What about the analysis of the numbers and the financials? How did you run your numbers, and did you find that you were wrong after the fact?
My father definitely had some real estate knowledge. I certainly did not have as much. So we did a very simple, cash flow analysis. So basically rents minus expenses, debt service, a percentage for maintenance and vacancy, and came up with a cash flow number. It was a very simple equation. The thing we probably left out of that equation was our maintenance number wasn't high enough, and our uncollected rent number we didn't really put that into the equation. We didn't understand that in this particular neighborhood, the amount of rent we could get per year and the amount of rent we were going to actually collect were very different numbers.
So you're talking about the delinquency factor, the tenants who are occupying your unit but not paying their rent. Your occupancy might be 100%, but if only 3 out of 4 of your tenants are actually paying their rent, then your actual physical occupancy is 75%.
Correct. That was the number that we didn't take into appropriate consideration based on the neighborhood we were in. And I think there's definitely a learning curve with tenants and screening tenants and getting tenants out quickly and honing your management style. So some of that was our learning curve, and some of that was us not fully understanding what we were getting into.
And how long did that learning curve take you before you were able to turn the property around and get tenants in who were paying rent?
I would say that property we turned around once we got over the sticker shock of paying for the city certification. I would say, within a year, we were pretty happy with the numbers that property was getting. Probably was not the type of property that we personally wanted to be managing, though. And that's, I think, the biggest thing we learned. And you as a investor, and especially if you're going to manage your own properties, have to understand what your tenant tolerance is. What type of tenants do you want to rent to? Who do you want to work with? And what type of properties do you want to be dealing with? And that's a very important thing to determine, and that will help set what type of properties and where you buy your investment properties and how happy you'll be with them.
So let's talk about your portfolio, because that obviously was not your last multifamily investment. You went on to build quite a portfolio. What did your criteria become after that 4-unit?
We have a very diverse portfolio. I find that with most of the clients that we work with, they seem to be single-family investors, duplex investors, side-by-side duplex. They seem to have a niche. I wouldn't say that we actually found a niche. We tended to try and buy the best available property we could find. So we have quite a few single families. We have some duplexes, some threeplexes, and some 4 units. Probably the one thing that if I was to start all over that I would have done differently is I probably would have bought a slightly higher class of property to start with, so I wouldn't have had to deal with quite so many maintenance expenses over the years.
And how do you distinguish between a slightly higher class? Is it the neighborhood? Is it the rents that the market rent for that neighborhood? I mean, what determines that for you?
Well, really all of those things. It's what's the market rent, it's what's the neighborhood, what type of tenant are you going to get to live there? And then there's the idea of the house itself. Some houses just require more maintenance. So is your house brick? Is it wood? Is it sided? What things are you going to have to do to maintain this house on a monthly to yearly basis? And to me, it really is really important to try and find a property that is as maintenance-free or as close to maintenance-free that you can get.
Which is kind of hard in Grand Rapids, because if you're buying in the area, downtown area or outside the downtown area, you have a lot of either pre-World War II housing, which could be 100 years old, or 50s and 60s type product. How do you compensate for that in your numbers? I mean, because I'd imagine most of your properties are probably quite old, just like mine are.
Yes, we have a lot of properties in Grand Rapids, and that's a lot of 1900s, 1920 stuff, a lot of originally built wood homes, some of them with actual rock foundations. So for me, it's trying to find a house that has some capital improvements in place. So sided, new windows, not a fan of the flat roof in Michigan with all the snow. So just making some of those decisions early on, or trying to budget into the equation when you're buying a property that you can side it or put new windows in. Because as much as those upfront costs can be, they're going to save you a lot of money over the long haul with having to go back and continue to fix screens or wood windows that won't stay up or things like that.
So when you buy a new property, are you going in with the money to fix it up to your standards right from the beginning?
At this point, yes. If we're planning to keep anything long term, we are looking for that no exterior maintenance or limited exterior maintenance, and having at least new or upgraded windows so that we don't have to deal with those things moving forward. You hear a lot of landlords talk about horror stories and people destroying their properties, and fortunately, I don't have any of those stories. We've been very fortunate with our tenants over the years. We've had very few malicious acts of destruction. Probably the worst thing that happened, we owned a house that we sold on land contract, so we had kept seller financing and sold it to they put a down payment down and moved in, and it was essentially their home. They made the payments. They eventually stopped making the payments, and we had to go for it through a foreclosure proceedings, which is shorter with a land contract than it would be with a conventional mortgage. And they had just let some things go, so they had a bathroom that had leaked, and they didn't let us know, so it leaked through the bathroom floor and then through the main level floor. So that was a mess, but it was a $2,000 problem, not a $20,000 problem. But that's really the only true act of tenant destruction. I mean, we've gotten some very filthy units back, and we've seen some very disgusting carpet and some dirty walls. But I think that, especially managing our own properties for so long, if you treat your tenants with respect and recognize that you have to train them as tenants but treat them as clients, I think people will treat you the best they can. So I think we've been fortunate because we treated people right.
Did you say train them as tenants?
Correct.
And treat them as clients? What does it mean to train your tenant?
Well, training your tenant has to do with the fact that, rent is due on the 1st, and they either have to direct deposit that or send that in. You can't go collect that from them. And letting them know what they can call you about and when they can call you. So setting reasonable office hours, being available, and having them call you when they have a true maintenance issue and not just calling you because they kind of want to talk or they think there's an issue.
Setting those boundaries and those barriers so that they respect you as an owner.
Yeah, so that they understand that when you pay the rent, I'm going to take care of your property, but you need to pay the rent. And I will be friendly with you, but we are not friends. And that's a pretty important distinguishment to make.
Yeah, I do notice a lot of times I see people who manage their own properties become friends with their tenants. And I think that can lead to a lot of issues, especially if those tenants take advantage of that friendship and start asking for, the ability to pay 2 weeks late.
Yeah, you definitely have to remember that it is a business. And that, I think, was a learning curve for my father and I. We were probably too nice to some people in the very beginning.
Let's talk about your business then, which is being a real estate broker for Compass Realty Services, and how you've taken your experience owning and managing rental property and become the number one broker for multifamily in the greater Grand Rapids area this past year. It seems like a logical transition, and I'd imagine you're probably offering insight and services to potential investors that they're not getting from the traditional realtor.
That's definitely how it evolved. My father and I have always been very involved with the Rental Property Owners Association. We've been members since the beginning, and we both sit on the board now. So when we got our licenses and we were just doing our own stuff, buying and selling our own properties, a lot of people from the RPOA would start asking us, hey, can you show us this house, or what do you think about this investment? So we started giving advice and showing some people houses, and then we kind of thought, wow, there's a lot of people, there's a need that I guess we should have known was there from our experience, but we didn't realize how big that need was and how few realtors out there actually own investment property or can talk about it as far as, what can you really get for a rental rate here? What kind of tenants are you going to attract? And Grand Rapids is a extremely pocketed city from block to block. And, what type of tenants will you get here versus there? And how can you, for what you want to do as an investor, reach your goals? And that's what I think is really important.
So what's the process you go through with if someone comes to you and says, I'm looking to buy a duplex or an investment property? If they're a complete newbie and they've never bought anything before, what's the process you take them through? What kind of questions do you ask them?
Well, the first question is, why do they want to own investment property and what are they trying to do? And you'd be surprised at people's answers. Some people want to quit the job they have. Some people want to put a kid through school. Some people want to have some retirement income. Some people are just looking to diversify their investments. So depending on what that goal is and how quickly they want to reach that goal determines a little bit on what properties might lend itself better to that.
What are some of the combinations? Like if someone if they want to quit their job, they're looking to make enough money from real estate to quit their job, what would you tell them?
The first thing I tell people about real estate, because I think a lot of people think they're going to buy an investment property and quit their job, is I tell them that investing in real estate is a marathon and not a sprint. And it's not something where you're going to buy 2 or 3 properties this year and quit your job. So if that's their goal, I try to talk to them about why that probably isn't going to work and how many properties do they really need to do that.
How many properties do that? I mean, what's the combination? What's the magic combination? Because I'm sure there are people out there listening right now who would love to quit their job, would love real estate income to take the place of their job income. Rarely do you hear anyone say, well, you need to have this many properties to get to where you want to be. I mean, what's the combination? What's the magic secret?
I wish I had the magic secret, but a lot of that depends on a person's own goals. So for some people, $40,000 a year, if that was, what they could have at the end of the year, they would be happy with that. For some people, that number's 100,000. For some people, that's 200,000. So it's first defining what's your number that you can realistically live on, and then do you have any other spousal income or residual income that you're going to be using for this goal, or is it truly just all coming from real estate? And then that determines what you can buy, and then also determines, are you going to be an active manager on your properties? Are you the one that are fixing your properties and doing your own maintenance? Or are you hiring people for that? Because all those things change those costs. So that's, I guess, the problem is there's probably a magic formula for every individual person, but there's no universal magic formula. And that's what I was talking about. My father and I have a very diverse portfolio, and that works for us because we like being in different areas, and the, I guess, unforeseen side effect of that is I know what it's like to manage properties in every area. I know what it's like to rent to every different type of tenant there is. So if I'm working with a client that wants to do A, B, or C, we've probably done that.
There's definitely a correlation between the types of area and the risk that's inherent in those areas and the returns you can get from your investment, because the reason people invest in C minus D type areas, which would be not so good neighborhoods, is because you can get higher returns.
Definitely. There is definitely a correlation between, or there should be a correlation between the less you pay for a property, the more cash flow potential you have. Now, I talk to clients and investors a lot about true cash flow and paper cash flow. So there's the numbers you write down on the paper with your projections, and then there's the reality of what's actually going to happen. And that's where I try to help people work with what's really going to happen in this property. The rent is $1,000 a month. Are you really going to collect $12,000 this year? Are you going to collect like $9,500? And just being off a little bit on those calculations can make a huge difference in how successful you are as a real estate investor. So it's very important to not only get the rental rate right, but how much of that you're going to collect, how long are you going to sit vacant, and when you do turn that unit, is that a unit that is going to take you a month to turn or 2 months to turn? You're going to lose 2 more months of rent, or it's going to take you $2,000 to rehab, or is it going to take you $5,000 to get back on the market? And understanding how those numbers work together in different areas and in different tenants and that type of thing is huge to how successful you will be.
If you're dealing with new investors, how do they go about determining those things that you just mentioned?
Well, again, a lot of that is what return are they looking for and how involved do they want to be. So let's say have a new investor, it's a single investor on their own, and they want to manage their own properties, and they have some maybe basic maintenance skills. So they can maybe do some painting and some minor fix-up stuff, and they can hire out some other stuff if they need to. So that person, to me, needs, they shouldn't buy that 5-bedroom, 2-bath house to start out with, because when that house goes vacant, it's going to take them an eternity to turn that unit, and that time is lost rent and vacancy. So maybe this person needs more of a smaller single family, maybe a 1,000 square foot, 3-bedroom, 1-bath that they can turn easily, that's going to be manageable for them, or they need a duplex in a neighborhood where they're happy to go over there and talk to the tenants and do some repairs, and they're going to be comfortable in that situation.
So you kind of assess the investor you're working with and help them figure out what type of property might be best for them.
Definitely. And that's, one of the questions that, we've been at properties with people, and I'll say to them, okay, so when this person calls you because their heat's out at 8 o'clock, are you going to drive over here and check this out? Or are you going to make an appointment with them in the morning? Are you comfortable doing that here? And if their answer is yes, then great. But they may look around and say, nope, this might not be where I want to do that. And they may need to be in, maybe a B neighborhood.
And what's your advice to investors that you work with regarding professional third-party property management?
I think you should always budget that number in, whether you plan to manage your own properties or not. I think you should be budgeting that number in, because most landlords at some point, if they don't today need to, will want to have a property manager manage their properties. And there's a lot of great third-party property management companies out there. I do think if you have the ability to at least manage your first on your own, because you maybe have a little time and it's, a small property and you can devote to that, just the things you will learn that will help you manage your property management company down the road are very beneficial. But I can, certainly help them with that process of, how do you interview a property management company? What qualities should they be looking for? And that's a very individual fit. There's some great property management companies that don't work for certain people based on their philosophies, but that doesn't make them a bad property management company. So you definitely have to find that niche and fit for the type of property you have and what a property manager manages well.
Now let's talk about more advanced people who own a couple rental properties that you work with. How do you help them as well?
Well, with those type of investors, it's, they know a lot about what they want to buy. And you do this with the newbies also, but it becomes more helping them realize the potential negatives with any investment. So if they're looking at a particular house, my job would be to go in and point out, okay, well, this layout situation is going to be challenging, or that commercial building behind this property is going to adversely affect your rent, or this layout situation may affect your resaleability. Certainly when buying multifamilies and especially duplexes, even though most of the people we work with are buy and hold landlords, it's still important to look at a potential exit strategy, even if you don't think you're going to be utilizing that for 20 or 30 years. But how quickly could I sell this property, or who would my end user be if I do sell this property? And if you own a duplex and it lends itself to being an owner-occupied duplex, which would mean maybe you have a slightly nicer, slightly larger, maybe a little higher amenity class in one of the units that's going to lend itself to that, or the location lends itself to that, that definitely increases the potential of what you can sell that property for. So what I try to do is help people recognize, I know you don't want to sell this right now, but these are the reasons that this will be good for you when you do, or these are the reasons it won't. And then having them make an informed decision about whether they want to proceed with that property or not.
And where are the people who come to you, your clients and investors from? Are they from the greater Grand Rapids area, or are you getting calls from investors in California now?
We work with investors all over. So we probably in the last 3 to 4 years have definitely seen a huge influx of out-of-state and even out-of-the-country investors. So I personally work with a lot of investors who have never even been to Grand Rapids and are never actually even planning to come to Grand Rapids. So in that situation, they hire me to find them a property. We talk about what their goals are, what they're looking to do with it, and then we basically handle the entire transaction. So look at the property, let them know, the pros and cons, what they expect their investment to be. They do a mobile closing, and those people clearly are hiring a property management company.
What are they looking for? A certain cap rate, a certain return?
They're either looking for a certain cap rate. It depends on the investor, but a lot of times people have read a lot of the great press that Grand Rapids has received over the last few years, and probably most of it pretty warranted. I mean, it's a great place to live. It's a great place to have rental property. It's a great community. But sometimes they come with a little bit of an unrealistic expectation. So one of my first questions to someone is, okay, so you're going to spend, what do you think you're going to spend, and what rental rate do you think you're going to get? So sometimes, people say, well, I want to spend $50,000 and I want to get rent of $1,200. And that's when we talk about that's not going to happen. So let's talk about what we really can do here.
So they want to buy a $50,000 single family and rent it out for $1,200 a month.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And they want to do that without doing any rehab or anything like that. So sometimes people come with unrealistic expectations. So the first thing is it's important to set, okay, what can you really do here? And then do they have the money to do that? And is that the return that they're going to be happy with? Because some people are looking for some unrealistic returns.
So let's talk about realistic and unrealistic returns. I mean, we're talking in September 2016 right now. So it changed. Yeah, every 12 months, what's realistic and what's unrealistic changes, or it could be even quicker than that. But
correct.
What is a realistic return? What's a realistic investment and a realistic return that you can get here in Grand Rapids?
Well, I think definitely 10 to 15% is a very realistic return.
That's cash, like a cap rate or cash on cash?
Probably
or
cash on cash.
Cash on. So that's a leverage 10 to 15%.
Correct. And depending on the investment, that can be more or less. And that, again, depends, again, on how involved the client wants to be and, how much they're going to spend. Because certainly if you're buying a more expensive property, that return might look a little smaller in the beginning, but sometimes those things will equal out over time, meaning that if you buy a less expensive property but your maintenance costs are higher, or you buy a more expensive property with less maintenance costs, those investments may be very similar after 5 years.
Spend a little bit more, you might get a nicer property that's going to be
probably
less
get a nicer
costly
property
over the long term.
And less hassles.
So what are some of the unrealistic expectations that someone might call you with?
Well, I think when we had the downturn, you could buy properties for $30,000, $40,000, sometimes even less, and put $10,000, $15,000 into them and have a pretty nice property that was at that time going to rent for probably $750 to $800. So I think sometimes people come thinking that Grand Rapids, although we have still great prices compared to some of the other areas, they're not that great anymore. It's really hard to buy a property under $50,000 in Grand Rapids that doesn't need quite a bit of work, or you wouldn't want to put quite a bit of work into. And that's what I always tell my clients is the best way to secure your investment. And as more people buy rental property in Grand Rapids, you are going to, see rents maybe flatten out a touch, and you are going to see, rental inventories go up, because certainly in the recessional area, you were seeing landlords buy houses that were traditionally owner occupied, and they were turning them into rental property. And you're actually seeing the exact opposite of this now. As some landlords get out of the business, they're taking what used to be rental property and they are now selling them to owner occupants. So I think inventory in rental property has shrunk a little bit. So I always tell my clients, if you can make sure that you're renting that slightly above average property as far as amenity grade, quality, cleanliness, you will always have a quality tenant that you can rent to.
The rental market in Grand Rapids, it's projected to increase.
Yes, I believe they're talking about the downtown area still being, even with the construction that's going on, probably 3,000 to 4,000 units underserved currently. So there certainly tends to be a need in Grand Rapids for rental property. Most of what's being built currently, though, is apartment complex type things in the downtown area. I think, some of my clients always say, well, it's my home in Wyoming or Grand Rapids, just in a regular neighborhood, who's going to want to live there? And I think there's always going to be people that want to live downtown and enjoy that lifestyle. And there's all going to be people who want to have pets and kids and have more of a yard and that type of situation. So I think that there's room for everyone in real estate. And that's the thing that's really unique about real estate is you can be very successful running single family houses. You can be very successful buying apartment complexes, and everything in between.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you is about the difference between investing in single-family rentals and multifamily rentals.
Well, that's interesting because typically when I talk to people, they usually come to me with an idea that they want to own either single families or they want to own small residential multifamily, so 2 to 4 units. And we talk through those things, and I'm always surprised at how people will change what they thought they wanted to do once they really understand the numbers. So to talk in some generalities, typically if you're buying a single family house, you're going to have less tenant turnover. That person's going to take on a little more ownership of that home and treat it a little more like their own. The nice thing about single families from an investment standpoint is that you're going to pass all the basically costs of that house onto the tenant. So they're going to be responsible for maintaining the lawn. They're going to be responsible for shoveling the walks.
They're going to pay all their utilities.
Pay all their own utilities, including water, which typically in a multifamily situation, the landlord's going to pay. And you also have a little better exit strategy, meaning that it's all things being equal. If someone has 10 single family houses or they have 10 duplexes and they call me tomorrow and say, Allison, I want to move to Tahiti and I need to sell all my property, I can probably sell those 10 single family houses quicker for them than those 10 duplexes. Now, having said that, there's an extreme shortage of multifamily houses in Grand Rapids, so that's probably not quite true today, but I think universally over time, that's going to hold true. So let's say you have a typical 3-bedroom, 1-bath home in Grand Rapids, and that's going to rent for, we'll say, $1,100. So as a investor, you're going to get your $1,100, you're going to pay property taxes, you're going to pay insurance, and then you're going to have a debt service or not a debt service. And then you can figure in based on the property and what type of maintenance vacancy you expect. But those are your only expenses. So you're not subtracting many actual expenses or costs off of that rent number. When you own a duplex or a smaller residential multifamily, you're dealing with more tenants and space. And unfortunately, people sometimes when they live close together can't get along. So you probably get more calls from a duplex, and that's going to just ramp right up the more units you have. So duplexes, because there's only 2, and especially in the side-by-sides, people have a little more space. So those are usually pretty reasonable. But you're definitely just in a 4-unit, you're going to get a lot more tenant calls and just tenant arguments or disagreements. You're going to be bothered more with a 4-unit than you will be with a duplex. But so in that duplex, you're going to have smaller, obviously, per unit rental rates. So let's say you have a typical 2-bedroom, 1-bath duplex. Both units are pretty similar, and you're going to rent those for, let's say, $750 a side. So now you have $1,500 worth of rent there. But in a duplex, probably your water's not split, so you're paying a water bill. Probably a lot of landlords will choose to pay trash in a duplex just to make sure that that trash is getting taken care of. And most landlords will maintain the lawn in a duplex situation. So by the time you take those costs away from your $1,500 in rent, you're not as far away from that $1,100 investment as you might have thought you were going to be with a duplex. I think a lot of people think when you buy a duplex, the cash flow is so much more than a single family. And it's not necessary. Usually there's more cash flow there, but when you take out the expenses, they might not be as far apart as you think, especially with single family rents on the rise at this point and being higher than we've ever seen here in Grand Rapids.
Yeah, we've definitely seen some rent appreciation here in Grand Rapids over the past 4 or 5 years. But you have a portfolio that has single family and multifamily. How many units do you have?
We probably have close to 50 units.
Okay, so between you and your father.
Correct.
Because you guys are partners. What's the ratio between single family and multifamily?
We probably have about 15 single family houses.
How are the returns on the single families that you own compared to the returns on the multifamily?
For us, our steadiest returners have always been our single families and our duplexes. So our 3 units and our 4 units have a few more peaks and valleys. To me, if you're going to own a 4 unit, it really has to be the right 4 unit, because just the tenants and space and the maintenance costs and the turnover, you have to really manage those very aggressively to get the returns you want. Those numbers change when you get into 40, 50 units, maybe even 20 units, then those numbers change. But I think sometimes that 4 unit, it really has to be the right 4 unit and managed pretty aggressively to get the returns you thought you might get. People always say to me, because we do have a diverse portfolio, when I'm talking with new investors, they say, well, you own a lot of properties. What do you like the best? And it's interesting because there's so many factors that go into what makes a great investment property. So if I had to rank my favorite properties that we own, I would actually pick 1 single family that we have, 1 duplex we have, and 1 4-unit that we have. And the reasons I like all of them are different. The duplex, we bought it at the right time, so we paid very little for it, put quite a bit of money into it, but we've had the same tenants in there the entire 5 years we've owned it. We have probably a little bit under market in rents, probably in more of a C- to D+ area, but we have had no turnover. We have had no maintenance costs, and we hardly hear from the people. So from a hassle standpoint and a return on investment, when you're not putting any maintenance costs into it because, nothing's getting broken and you fix the things when you got it. That just really makes no turnover. That really makes your investment look really great. And then we have a single family house that we actually just bought recently. So actually paid more for it than I've paid for any single family home. But it's all brick, 5-bedroom, 2-bath, college rental that's set up just perfectly. So every bedroom has a closet in the bedroom, and then they have actually a closet outside. So it's just ideally set up for what and who we want to rent to. So it's very easy to rent. We get a premium rental rate from college students for that. So that's also been a great investment.
So you bought that recently?
We did. But last year.
What did you pay for it?
We paid $102,000 for it, which seems like a ton for a single-family house for someone who bought most of their single-family houses when the market was down.
When you could buy a single family for $20,000, $30,000.
Correct. So that seemed like a lot of money.
Okay, so you bought it for $102,000. What neighborhood is it in?
It would be what I would consider probably actually a B+ to A- neighborhood. And the only reason we were able to buy it at that price, so probably a similar house in a slightly different location in that neighborhood, probably would be 150, 160. This particular house sits where major highway on and off ramps are. So it's very busy in front of this property. So it probably is not as conducive to owner occupants wanting to own this particular house and the immediate houses that are adjacent to it.
So it's more suited for college students then?
Correct. So has plenty of parking. It's, like I said, it's a brick house. All the windows have been updated. The roof was new when we bought it. And we negotiated that the seller would put in a new furnace when we purchased it. So all the basic capital improvements were done and, good for the basically next 20 years.
And is it walkable to downtown and the colleges, universities?
It's on the outskirts of being walkable. As downtown is pushing west in Grand Rapids, it will become more walkable. It would be close to John Ball Park, but it's mainly kind of located between Grand Valley's kind of Allendale campus and downtown, much closer to downtown. But it lends itself very well to students that are going between those two campuses based on its location. And it has a convenient layout as far as common space and enough space for students to be close if they want to, but find space if they don't want to be close.
Are you charging per door, or are you just charging one lump sum?
Well, I believe, the students are going to be splitting that up per bedroom. We're running that for $1,850 a month right now. And it was pre-leased even before, this true season started. So it was pre-leased in February. And so basically the current tenants moved out and the new tenants moved in. Also, when we purchased it, the current rent when we purchased it was only $1,300. So we purchased it, they were under market for rent at that time, and we did very little because it was pretty much ready to go, and then increased the rent.
So you had a $550 upside in rent there.
Correct. And the nice thing about this to me is, and this is what I always talk to, I think investors don't look enough at future costs and maintenance costs. So not only did obviously the upside of rent work for us, but just I know based on how this property is set up and what's been done to it and how we bought it, we're not going to have to put very much money into it in the foreseeable future. So that's going to make those numbers that we have each year better. So when you kind of look at the first blush, okay, that's a lot of money to pay. But when you look at the rent that you're going to get and the return and the expected low maintenance costs, it turns out to be a pretty good investment.
Yeah, and your costs would be maintenance, which is pretty low at this point, possibly management. Are the tenants paying their own utilities?
Tenants are paying their own utilities. They're in charge of trash, lawn, water, snow. So we have no monthly.
You basically have pity, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance.
Correct.
Did you finance this?
We actually did a 1031 exchange. So we sold a 4-unit property we had south of Grand Rapids, and we took those proceeds and put them into this property and then got a loan for the balance.
1031 exchange. Let's talk about that, because that might be a new concept to some of our listeners.
So a 1031 exchange allows you to defer your gains. So you own a property, and let's say your gain was going to be $30,000. The government is going to tax you on that $30,000 in the year that sale was made. But let's say your plan is to buy more investment property with it anyway. You don't have another use for that $30,000. So you do what they call a 1031 exchange. So you have to identify properties that you're going to buy with the money, but when you close on the property you're selling, that money is basically held in escrow. And then when you close...
And you have what, like 90 days to identify property?
I believe you have about 90 days.
Mm-hmm. So you have 90 days to identify a property, and then another, 90 days to actually close on that property?
Correct.
Okay, so did you know what property you were going to buy once you sold the 4-unit, or how long did it take you to identify this one?
We actually had the 4-unit already for sale when we found this property. And actually, this was a property that a client of mine was going to purchase, the brick 5-bedroom property. A client of mine was going to purchase, and at the last moment, she backed out and said she, couldn't move on with the sale. And I said, well, it's a good property. I don't want to see you miss this. And she goes, I know it is, but I just can't do it right now. So I said, well, I wasn't really looking to buy a property, but the numbers work. So are you okay with me purchasing? She goes, oh, that would be great. Enjoy it. So it kind of fell into place that the 1031 exchange worked for us. So we kind of had a sale already in process when we identified the property. So in this case, the identification aspect of the 1031 exchange for us was very easy.
So you sold your 4-unit, and I take it your profit was enough to just roll it right into this single family.
Correct. Yes. So we had no out-of-pocket cash from us to change that. So,
was there any profit above and beyond that? Because you would think a 4-unit would be worth more than a single family house.
You would. This particular 4-unit was in a fairly rural area, and we had actually sold it on a land contract. We had bought it pretty distressed, and we had sold it pretty distressed, and the land contract person had left it pretty distressed.
Okay, so it was a distressed 4-unit.
Yes.
But you were able to sell it for enough that you could roll it right.
Yes, we were able to sell
this.
it for a profit and roll that into the... So from our standpoint, we basically had a, I would say a lower performing asset that we turned into a much more productive asset.
And that's the great thing about a 1031 exchange, because I've done that as well, where I actually sold a 4-unit and rolled that through a 1031 exchange into a 5-unit that was actually on the same street, but it was a much better performing asset for me, and it still is. And you were able to do that into a single family. And the government doesn't have a problem with that, because usually they want you to go from from a like type property, but it needs to be more valuable.
Typically, it's in the value, and
Mm-hmm.
like is kind of in parentheses as to what a like kind property is. So this was an investment property, and the second property was more valuable, even though it had less units. Mm-hmm. So that qualified to meet the like kind exchange.
So the profit you made off of selling that 4-unit, you don't pay any taxes on. Because you've 1031'd it into the single family. Eventually, when you sell that single family, you'll pay the taxes. But you could keep doing 1031 exchanges and never pay those taxes.
Correct. So it also, the nice thing about a 1031 exchange is, so it does allow you to sometimes change your cash flow picture even. So if you can 1031 exchange maybe a higher profit from a property than you would maybe put in as a down payment normally. Now you've changed your kind of debt to income ratio there in that property. So your debt to expense ratio. So you have less debt, more cash flow, but it didn't cost you more money.
Right. So you did a 1031. You don't have any loan then on this single family that you just bought?
We have a small loan.
You have
Yeah.
So you did take out a loan.
Correct. For the
but
remainder.
your so what you're saying is your loan to value ratio is much lower.
It's lower than it would have been if we had just strictly bought this property and put down our 20%.
Your 25%.
Correct.
You have more
equity.
More equity, like say 40, 50%.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
So, which means you also have more cash flow because your debt service each month is a lot less.
Correct.
So that's nice. So how much would you say you did improve your cash flow?
I would say we probably improved it at least 50%. Well, it's probably more, again, because we'd sold the 40 and land contracts, so our cash flow was smaller than it would be on a strict rental basis. We actually had sold it to one family that was, their whole family was living in the units. And like I said, it was distressed when we sold it to them, so it's a little, the margins on that are a little different than they might have been had we obviously upgraded that property and taken it to its full potential. So I would say we took our cash flow numbers probably from about 400 to closer to 1,000.
That's fantastic.
So
that's great.
Yeah, it's and it cost really, I mean, there's always a cost, but there was no true out-of-pocket costs to us to make that exchange.
So you basically increased your income by about $7,200 a year, your cash flow.
Correct. And we now have a more valuable asset. Like I said, the asset that we sold was distressed. Mm-hmm. And we now have, a very nice home in a, very nice neighborhood.
Do you work with investors then who are also doing 1031 exchanges?
Yeah, we definitely do. We don't, the 1031 exchange process itself is typically done by a third party. So we talk to our clients about how those work and we put them in touch with the people, but we don't actually administer the 1031 exchange.
Yeah. By the way, it's very important if you are thinking of doing a 1031 exchange that you talk to the intermediary, a third-party intermediary, before you sell your current property. Because I've talked to people who have sold a property and then decided they wanted to do a 1031 exchange, but by then it's too late. So if you are considering doing a 1031 exchange, find that third-party intermediary first before you sell.
Definitely.
Otherwise, it's too late because once your hands are on that check
and
the money's in your pocket, you're paying taxes on it, right? As we wrap it up here, what advice do you have for people who are looking to get into real estate investing and those who are already in real estate investing and want to take it to the next level?
Well, I definitely think that a big part of real estate investing is networking and making sure that you're working with the right people. So it's especially important for the people who are thinking about or considering investing in any type of rental property that you talk to people who either are doing what you want to do or know how to do what you want to do, and just making sure that you're working with those people. And kind of along the same lines for, I think, the more advanced investors, I work with the Rental Property Owners Association on a mastermind group where there's a group of investors that have been investing for probably 10 plus years collectively into all kinds of different investments. And it serves as a networking group to bounce things off and just to try and push yourself to the next level. So definitely continuing to surround yourself with people that are doing what you do or doing what you want to do and being successful at it.
Yeah, and the RPOA is a great resource for that kind of networking. And what other resources, books, or information is out there that you would direct people to?
Well, I definitely think there's a lot of really good books out there by a number of different artists, or different authors. I think it's very important, though, to recognize that some of those people are actively doing those things and some of those people are not, and that not everything works in every market, and markets are very specific.
Allison, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I've enjoyed our conversation, and I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of it, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
You've been listening to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association. You can find out more at rpoaonline.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and review.